It is the hottest part of the day. A man sits at the entrance of his tent in the Negev, in the shade, because there is no other shade. He is 99 years old, and he has been in this desert for decades. A man who left everything he knew because a voice told him to go, and he went. He does not know, sitting here in the heat of the afternoon, that today is the day everything changes. 3 strangers appear on the road. He sees them. He runs. A 99-year-old man runs towards strangers in the desert, because hospitality in this world is not optional, it is sacred, and he bows, and he begs them to stay, and he goes to tell his wife. His wife is inside the tent. She has been inside the tent for 25 years of promises. Her name is Sarah. She is 89 years old, and she is about to hear something through a tent wall that will make her laugh, and the sound of that laugh will echo for the next 3,000 years. This is not a story about Abraham and Apos' faith. This is not a story about a miracle pregnancy. This is not a story about what God can do when the conditions are right and the person is ready. This is a story about what God does with a woman who has stopped believing. A woman who was faithful for decades and then, in one unguarded moment, let out the laugh she had been holding since the beginning. The laugh that says, "This is never going to happen." Stay with me, because the part of this story most people never reach is not the miracle. It is what God says after she laughs. It is what he names the baby. And there is one line she speaks, at the very end of this story, when she is holding her son, that I have never once heard read aloud at a women and Apos' retreat. We will get there, but not yet. First, you need to understand what 25 years in a desert actually does to a person. Sarah was not always old. She was not always waiting. There was a moment, early in this story, when she was a young woman with a new husband and a whole life ahead of her, and God made a promise. A specific promise. A son, descendants as numerous as the stars. A nation. A legacy. She believed it. Of course she believed it. She was young, and the promise was magnificent, and the God who made it had just called her husband out of everything familiar into something new. And the air was charged with the feeling that you get when you are at the beginning of something that is going to matter. But then the years passed. 1 year. 5. 10. The promise did not come. She was not pregnant. She was still faithful. She was still waiting. She prayed the way you pray when you are still, underneath the doubt, holding on to the belief that God remembers what he said. 15 years. 20. And here is what most people miss. God had not spoken in years. Not a word. Not a vision. Not a dream. The promise was made, and then the silence began, and Sarah kept living inside that silence, kept being a wife, kept moving tent by tent through the wilderness, and nobody told her how long this was going to take. Nobody told her it would be 25 years. Nobody told her she was going to be 90 years old, sitting in a tent in the heat of the afternoon, when she finally heard the answer. But here is what the text actually says happened next. Go back to the beginning. Because to understand what this moment costs her, you have to understand everything that came before it. Her name, when the story starts, is Sarai, not Sarah. That comes later. She is living in Ur of the Chaldees, which is modern-day Iraq, one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world. She is not a wanderer. She is not a nomad. She is the wife of a successful man in a stable city, and her life has a shape to it. Then God speaks to her husband. Genesis 12 opens with 4 words, and quote, "Leave your country," and quote, "That is all. Go." Not a destination. Not a timeline. Not a guarantee. Just go. And Abraham goes, and he takes his wife with him, and the text lists the people in the caravan, and Sarai is there. She is in the caravan. She leaves Ur, leaves the city, leaves every structure of the life she knew, and the text does not ask her what she thinks about it. It does not record whether she was afraid. It simply says she went. She went. That is faith. Quiet, unrecorded, assumed faith. The kind women in the Bible keep giving that never makes it into the sermons. But the very first crisis they face after leaving is this. There is a famine. Abraham takes the family to Egypt. And here, barely 2 chapters into this woman and Apos' story, something happens that the church has spent centuries either minimizing or skipping entirely. Abraham turns to his wife in the road to Egypt and says, "You are beautiful. Too beautiful. If the Egyptians see you, they will kill me to have you. So tell them you are my sister." Let that sit for a moment. He asks her to lie. He asks her to enter Pharaoh and Apos' household as an unmarried woman, which means she could be taken as a wife or a concubine in order to protect his own life. And she does it. The text says she does it. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, describes this moment with more weight than the Bible text gives it. He notes that Sarah and Apos' beauty was extraordinary enough to captivate the Egyptian court, and that the situation was deeply dangerous for a woman of her background. Abraham and Apos' plan put her at risk so that he could be safe. She was not the one who was afraid. He was. She went into Pharaoh and Apos' house. God had to send plagues on Egypt to get her out. And then they left Egypt, and the years kept passing, and the promise did not come. And one day Sarah looked at her own body and made a decision. A painful, desperate, legal decision. She had an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. The laws of the time, written into Mesopotamian legal codes, etched into clay tablets we have dug out of the ground and read, permitted a barren wife to give her slave woman to her husband, so that any child born of that union would be counted as the wife and Apos' heir. Sarah did not invent this. She was doing the only legal thing available to a woman in her position who had run out of options and out of hope. She gave Hagar to Abraham. The Hebrew word for what she does in Genesis 16 is natan, to give, to hand over. It is the same word used when a father gives a daughter in marriage. She gave something that was hers. She gave her own plan, her own backup, her own last resource, because she had stopped believing God was going to do what he said. And Hagar became pregnant immediately. Pay attention to this. The moment Hagar conceives, something breaks in Sarah. The text says Hagar began to despise her mistress. And Sarah and Apos' response is not gracious. She goes to Abraham in fury, and she sends Hagar away. She is harsh. She is not handling this well. She is a woman watching the consequences of her own despair walk around her household with a growing belly, and she cannot stand it. This is the part nobody tells you. Sarah was not a villain in this moment. She was a woman who tried to solve a problem God had left unsolved, and the solution made everything worse, and she did not have the emotional capacity to handle what came next. 3,000 years separate you from her. The feeling does not. You have made a decision out of desperation and watched it unravel. You know what it is to try to take something into your own hands because the waiting became unbearable. You know what it is to look at what you built and realize it is not what you wanted, and you cannot undo it. Sarah could not undo it. Ishmael was born. He was not the son of the promise. He was the son of the plan. And then God went quiet for 13 more years. 13 years. Sarah lived inside that silence with the evidence of her own impatience growing up in her household. And then, Genesis 17, God appeared again. He changed Abram and Apos' name to Abraham. He changed Sarai and Apos' name to Sarah, a name that means princess, that means mother of nations. And he made the promise again. Same promise. More specific this time. A son from Sarah, not from a slave girl. From her. The Hebrew name God assigns to this promise is El Shaddai. It is the name he uses when he makes the covenant. Most translations give you in quote, God Almighty in quote, which is accurate but loses something. The root word, shad, is related to the word for breast, for nourishment, for the source that provides what a body cannot produce itself. El Shaddai is not just the God who is powerful. He is the God who is enough. The God who provides from himself what you cannot produce on your own. The God who makes barren women mothers. And now watch what happens next. It is the hottest part of the day. We are back at the tent. The three strangers are there. Abraham has run to meet them, bowed to the ground, begged them to stay. He tells Sarah to make bread. He selects a calf. He brings curds and milk. He stands near them under the tree while they eat. And in the ancient world, this moment is extraordinary. These are not ordinary guests. The text makes this clear as the story unfolds. Two of them are angels. And the third, most theologians across history have read this figure as God himself, present in human form, sitting at a table in the Negev, eating a meal. God is sitting in the shade outside the tent. Sarah is inside. This is not an accident. This is culture. In the ancient Near East, a respectable woman did not sit with male guests she did not know. She stayed inside. She prepared the food. She did not enter the guest area. So when the visitor speaks, when he says, and quote, "Where is your wife Sarah?" and quote, and Abraham says, and quote, "There, in the tent," and quote, and then the visitor says, and quote, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." End quote. Sarah hears this through a tent wall. She hears the promise made for her, about her, through fabric and air. She is not in the conversation. She is not asked. She is not addressed directly. She is the subject of a sentence spoken to her husband in a world where that is simply how things worked. And she laughs. The Hebrew word is tzachak. It appears here in Genesis 18, and it will appear again in chapter 21, when she speaks at Isaac and Apos' birth. But I need to tell you something that almost no preacher mentions when this text comes up. Abraham laughed first. Go back one chapter. Genesis 17. God makes the same promise, a son from Sarah. And Abraham, the father of faith, the man the entire epistle to the Romans is built around. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. The text says he laughed and said in his heart, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? He laughed, and nobody talks about it. The sermons are not about Abraham and Apos' laughter. The women and Apos' conferences are not about how the patriarch of 3 world religions laughed in God and Apos' face first. It is Sarah and Apos' laugh that gets preached. It is her doubt that gets the emphasis. But they both laughed. The difference, and this is the part that undoes me, is what God does next. When Abraham laughs in chapter 17, God does not call him on it. He continues the conversation. He answers Abraham and Apos' question. He moves on. But when Sarah laughs in chapter 18, inside the tent where she thought no one could hear her, God stops. He turns. He asks, why did Sarah laugh? Not in anger, not in punishment, in acknowledgement. God heard her. The woman behind the tent wall. The woman who was not in the room. The woman who had been waiting for 25 years and had made her worst decision in year 15 and had lived with it in silence for 13 more. God heard the sound she made in private when she thought no one was listening. And he asked, is anything too hard for the Lord? That question is not rhetorical. That question is a confrontation with the specific nature of her doubt. Not, are you a bad person? Not, how dare you question me? But, Sarah, tell me, is there anything I cannot do? She was afraid. The Hebrew word is yair, not a polite kind of nervous, but a full body shaking, the kind of fear that happens when something holy gets very close to something broken. She denied it. I did not laugh, she said. And God said, you did laugh. 3 words. Not a rebuke. A fact. A gentle, unmovable insistence on the truth of what she felt. He was not going to let her pretend. He was not going to accept the performance of faith when the real thing, the broken, exhausted, 25-year-old version, was right there, available to him. He sees what you laugh in private. He is not afraid of it. Here is the thing women are never told about this moment. Sarah and Apos' laugh was not a disqualification. God did not say find someone with better faith. He did not reassign the promise. He did not wait for her to apologize and try harder. He sat at a table outside her tent and said, Sarah will have a son. Exactly as promised. Exactly on time. Which, in God and Apos' timeline, was 25 years later than Sarah thought it should have been, and exactly when it was always going to be. The guests rose and left. The moment passed, and the Lord did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She was 90 years old. The text does not soften this. Genesis 21, verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. The language is deliberate, as he had said, what he had promised. This is not a surprise to God. This is a kept appointment. The calendar he was running on was not the one Sarah had been watching for 25 years. She conceived. She bore Abraham a son in his old age. And then comes the line I have been waiting to give you, the line I told you about at the beginning. The line nobody reads at the women and Apos' retreat. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Read that again slowly. Not, God has forgiven my laughter. Not, despite my laughter, God was gracious. Not, I should not have laughed, but God was merciful. She said, God has brought me laughter. She claimed it. She received it. She stood in the sunlight holding her son and said, the laughter God heard through my tent wall, the laughter I tried to hide, the laughter I was ashamed of, God picked that up and gave it back to me full. And then, everyone who hears will laugh with me. Her private moment of broken faith became a public declaration of joy. The things she did alone in the dark, the sound she made when she had nothing left, became the sound she gave to everyone around her. The laugh did not disappear. It was redeemed. Now watch what God named the baby. The name is Isaac. In Hebrew, Yitzhak, from the root Sachak. He laughs. God named the miracle after the moment she doubted. I need you to feel the weight of that. God looked at 25 years of waiting and one unguarded laugh of disbelief, and the name he chose for the child whose descendants would become the nation of Israel, through whose lineage Jesus of Nazareth would be born, whose name would be spoken by every Jewish parent for 3,000 years. That name is the Hebrew verb for what Sarah did when she stopped believing. He made her doubt into a dynasty. There is a woman I want you to think about. She has been sitting in a waiting room for a long time. Not a hospital, necessarily, though maybe that too. The waiting room of a promise. The kind of room you walk into full of faith and sit in until your faith wears down to the studs. She has prayed. She has believed. She has declared and journaled and held on. And then one day, alone, in a car or a shower or a bathroom floor, she let out the laugh. Not a happy one. The one that sounds like crying and Apos, exhausted older sister. The one that says, I am too tired to be sad anymore. I no longer believe this is coming. She thought God did not hear that. He heard it. The God whose name in this chapter is El Shaddai. The God who provides from himself what you cannot produce yourself. He does not require you to show up to the miracle with your faith fully intact. He does not ask you to perform certainty you do not have. He does not look at the laugh you gave in private and see a woman who has disqualified herself from the promise. He sees a woman who has waited a very long time. And he says, I will return at the appointed time. If this is speaking to something you are carrying right now, tell me in the comments what promise you are still waiting on, even if you have stopped believing it. Especially if you have stopped believing it. I read every one. Because here is what I want you to carry out of Sarah and Apos' story. She was not rewarded for perfect faith. She was not given Isaac because she finally got her trust levels high enough. She was given Isaac because God made a promise and God keeps his promises, and the only thing her laugh changed was the name of the child. God took what she was ashamed of and wrote it into the birth certificate. Her doubt became the name of the miracle. 3 things. The first, Sarah is the only woman in the entire Bible whose age at death is recorded. Genesis 23 opens with this. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. That is not a throwaway detail. In a text that rarely bothers with women and Apos' statistics, the author stopped to write down how long she lived. Because her life mattered. Because she was not a supporting character in Abraham and Apos' story. She was the mother of a nation, and the Bible made sure you knew she had a full life. Not just a miraculous moment at the end of it, but 127 years of it. She is also listed in Hebrews 11, the faith chapter, the Hall of Fame. By faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. That is her epitaph in the New Testament. Not despite her laughter, not even though she doubted. By faith. Because faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is what remains after the doubt, when you are still, somehow, in the story. The second, you are not too late. You have not waited too long. You have not doubted too much. You have not made a decision, a Hagar decision, a desperate, I will do this myself decision. That puts you outside the reach of what God promised. Sarah made that decision. She lived with it for 13 years. And God showed up after 13 years of silence and said, same promise, still standing, and I am naming your child after the sound you made when you stopped believing. God does not recalculate the promise based on how well you held on. He finishes what he starts. The third, and this is the one I want you to take with you. Sarah laughed. Not the good kind. The exhausted, done, 25 years is too long kind. The kind you do when you are behind a tent wall and you think no one can hear you. And God heard it. And God did not shame her. He did not correct her. He asked one question, is anything too hard for the Lord? And then he did the thing he said he would do. And then he told her what to name the baby. He called the baby laughter. He took the sound of her broken faith and made it the name that 3,000 years of mothers have called across backyards and dinner tables and school hallways. He did not erase what she felt. He redeemed it. He built it into the story so permanently that you cannot tell the history of Israel without saying the name that means she laughed. What is the laugh you gave in private? What is the thing you did when you thought no one was listening? The moment of doubt, the exhausted release, the sound of a woman who has been waiting too long. God heard it, and he is not done with what he promised. She laughed, and God said, "Good. We will call him that."